Good morning, church. We are concluding today our Joy in Loving People series, and it is my honor to get to welcome our guest speaker, Chris Legg. Pastor Chris Legg, LPC, and his wife Ginger have been living out the great parable of God's love for his people since 1993 and have been blessed with 5 amazing kids. He's the lead pastor of South Spring Baptist Church in Tyler, Texas, and is also the founding owner of Aletheia Family Counseling Center. Would you please welcome Chris Legg?
Thanks, Ben. All right. We're going to jump right in. I love the theme of finding joy and loving others that you guys have been doing. It's one of the indicators. It's talking about marriage today and finding joy in our relationships within marriages and beyond that, and the God who created marriage. I'll be moving pretty quickly through this kind of stuff. Part of why my son and I turned this into a book is because it's really hard to talk about some of this stuff in different settings, sometimes because of who the audience is, sometimes because of the time limits that you have, all that kind of stuff. And so today I hope will be encouraging to you. I will do my best to unpack this. It's going to be a real challenge. I believe in the biblical role of this sacred pulpit. In fact, at South Spring today, they will be going through Luke. We teach straight through a book, and we just keep doing that. And when you guys had this theme, Wayne read the book. He was one of the first readers of the book and said, I want you to come. And it turned out Father's Day was the perfect day to come and share some of this stuff, hopefully as an encouraging message for you guys. I know Father's Day sermons are kind of infamous. Mother's Day sermons are always like, moms, you rock. You're the best. You do everything awesome. And Father's Day sermons are like, come on, dads, you can do better. You should get right with this. And that's kind of the perspective, always the case. I hope that's not the case today. I hope the opposite, that you'll be encouraged by this conversation and hopeful about your marriage or your future marriage, or if God has gifted you with singleness, just encouraged with the understanding of who the God is who would give this thing to us called marriage. So we'll take this seriously, and I will be moving quickly. So with that in mind, especially I think many to most, maybe, I don't know how to feel about that as a therapist. Christian marriages, I think many are failing. Even the ones that are staying together are failing. As we see today, a brand new study that comes out, for example, relating to Father's Day, that in the United States apparently, I don't know if I buy this yet, I want to do some more research, just heard it this morning, is that among the nations of the world, America ranks first in fatherlessness. That seems shocking to me if that's accurate, but wow, even if we're close to first, that's terrifying, and again shows the power of marriage and the power of the significance of marriage, that one of the greatest gifts we can give our children is to love their mom or dad well. And most of us are radically unprepared to do it. We got married with zero training. Maybe you got premarital counseling, which may have even been worth the time to do, maybe not. Sometimes that's just a train wreck all the way around. We prepare for years and years and years for a career, and then most of us, especially men, have never even read a single marriage book or marriage conference, and we're supposed to somehow figure this thing out that's so much more difficult than a career. And we had an adventure this year in my family, which was that our eldest son got married, and which was fantastic and a great experience. In the meantime, as we were developing this, he is a gifted writer, and that's why he was helping me write this. At the time, he was neither married nor had sex, and yet he was writing this book with me, which was fantastic because he's a great writer. But I will tell you what, if you want to have a mirror put in your face, write a book about marriage and sex with your own kid. You get to hear all kinds of things about what your marriage actually looks like to your own children. And so it was a great gift to get to spend that time with him and do that. So I'm going to unpack this basic concept quickly, that really there are 2 ways to come at this question of marriage. What is marriage and where does it come from? And one is the secular kind of sociological perspective, which is this. Someday, many millions of years ago, or at least hundreds of thousands of years ago, there was a caveman, And this caveman wanted to have sex whenever he wanted to. And there was a cave woman who wanted to have protection and provision for her children. And they said, you've got a commodity that I want, and you've got a commodity that I want. What if we traded commodities? Right? What if we created this little exchange system, and so long as I continue to keep you well provided with the commodity that you won't go seek that out with other cave women or cavemen, and vice versa. And so they created this kind of transactional contract, and that's the root source of marriage. Now, shockingly, if you've been to many even Christian marriage conferences, read even Christian marriage books, sometimes, I think more often than not, sadly, this is the perspective presented of what marriage is. That marriage is, he's got certain wants and needs, she's got certain wants and needs. Hey, we ought to get together and make a trade. Let's negotiate. I will give you as little of my commodity as I can possibly get away with giving you, and you give me as little of your commodity as you can possibly give away with giving me, and we'll both complain about it the whole time, and yet at least we will kind of at the bare minimum get what we want, at least enough so that neither one of us go find that commodity someplace else. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? It's beautiful. And so many in the room right now or listening online or wherever are going, you just described my marriage. You just described my premarital counseling. You just described the last 5 Christian marriage books that I've read. What's wrong? I'm glad you asked. Very often, men begin to feel like a paycheck in their marriages, and women begin to feel like, well, something much worse. Is it believable that this is the source of the institution of marriage? And if not, why does it get portrayed that way? Is it even the case that that you say, even in the secular world, does this explain what marriage is? So let me present this to you. A few years ago at the University of Virginia, Dr. James Cone ran into an interesting insight. Dr. Cone, sorry, my voice is still recovering over one of those deals that you get and then you have to deal with it. So I apologize for that you have to listen to it. So Dr. Cone was a researcher on post-traumatic stress disorder and stress and anxiety relief. And so what he would do is he would interview combat veterans and help them figure out how to de-stress and deal with those issues. And he says that one day he was meeting with this codger, old combat veteran codger, comes in by himself, sits in his room, and he says, well, sir, here's what we start with. We start with sharing your story. So please share with me your story as a combat veteran. And the grizzled old guy says, no. And he's like, okay, well, I guess we could just go ahead and jump ahead to the relaxation techniques and the breathing techniques. And so how about if we start into that? Let's start with the de-stressing part of this whole experience. And the old veteran said, no. Dr. Cohen was like, that's kind of all I got. I guess we're done for the day. He said, the old man said, tell you what, I'll come back next week and I'll bring my wife. So next week, the old guy comes back and Dr. Cohen sits down and says, okay, now let's talk about your experiences. And the old man said, no. And his wife reached over, put her hand on his hand and said, it's okay, honey, I'm here. And the old man tells his story. And they get done, and he says, okay, so let's go do some of these breathing things. Let's deal with some of the stress things and how we can figure that kind of thing out. Let's work on that. And the old man said, no. And his wife reached over and put her hand on his hand again and said, it's okay, honey, I'll do it with you. And then they did it. And Dr. Cohen says all he could think about during this whole experience was, what am I watching? What is this that I just saw happen? I just saw this combat veteran, this tough old guy who's never been afraid of anything in his life, who knows how to, who's tough and rough and able to take care of himself. And when he runs into a moment that he cannot deal with, all it takes is a simple touch from his old wife, and all of a sudden he's okay. What did I just see? So he says it had sent him down a path. He runs a whole series of experiments. They're a little sadistic, but they worked. So what he did is he put people into an MRI machine, which is already terrifying for a lot of us, right? Imagine me put an MRI machine, and then he says, while you're in here, we've got you all plugged in, we've got you all, all this, and we're going to flash colors in front of your eyes, and if the color blue flashes in front of your eyes, then there's a 25% chance you're going to receive an electric shock. Okay? Now, you can imagine people's anxiety, which is already up here, just being in the machine at all of a sudden it's like, and when the blue color flashes, their anxiety goes through the roof. So he had the control group that experienced that, and then he had another group that what they had was a total stranger, a nurse come and hold this nurse will hold your hand while you're going through this experience. And their anxiety, those people's anxiety dropped almost 15% from the top with just a total stranger holding their hand. But what he had also done is he had run and evaluated the level of how good these marriages were these people had. And the ones who were in really good marriages, what he did is say, okay, you can have your spouse in the room with you, hold your hand. And the spouse would come in and hold their hand, and their anxiety levels would drop back to baseline, even under those conditions. Now, those of us who are married, if you're in a great marriage, you're like, I get this, right? There is someone in the room who's holding my hand who, if necessary, will kill everybody else in the room to keep me safe, right? Who will fight for me to the death if that's what's called for. And their anxiety dropped down to 0. Then he ran a secondary part of this, which is fascinating, which is when he said, okay, now you're in the MRI machine. When the color flashes blue, so remember, these people's anxiety drops to nothing. Now when the color flashes blue, it's not you that's going to get shocked. It's the person whose hand you're holding. They're going to get shocked. And all of a sudden, their anxiety spiked back up to the highest levels. They were much more concerned about their spouse getting shocked than they were themselves getting shocked. And Dr. Cohen, a secular man as far as I know, says, it's as if these two people have developed one mind. Well, someone should have told him. Someone should have told him that a long time ago there was a God who predicted that, who said that would be the case. I don't think the caveman model even works for him. Even what he's learning is not explained by that. I have a different theory. It's this. There's a creator who intelligently and intentionally designed and created not only the whole universe and its laws, but designed and created certain institutions with purpose, intentionality as well. Marriage proceeded from God proclaiming, this is the first thing in creation that God proclaimed it was not good. You see God give himself a grade after each day of creation. He creates and he goes, yep, I rock. And I'm a creator. Yep, that was great too. I nailed that one. This was perfect. I've got all this. He gets to the end of some point and he goes, you know what? But it's not good that the boy's alone. The first thing he creates that's not good is the fact that Adam is alone. And so God solves this, not with more time with God. Hey, I'm not going to walk in the morning and the evening with you. No, he solves this with another person. This is a powerful picture for us. It's intentional. We see it all through the Old Testament, and I know I'm jumping from lily pad to here. I apologize for that. It's just the time limits as we fly through this. If you're taking notes and you want to write these down and look at them later, Hosea chapters 1 and 2, Ezekiel chapter 6, 16 and 34, Jeremiah 3 through 5, Lamentations 1, Amos chapter 3, Isaiah chapter 57, and many others. What you see is God sending a prophet to confront his people on the fact that they've gone to other gods, and in that, he calls it adultery. Adultery. It's as if God is comparing his relationship to his people to marriage. I believe God created marriage to be a picture of God's relationship to his people. Too often we think, like with fatherhood, we go like, oh, we have fathers. God must be kind of like that. That's an error, ladies and gentlemen. Church, I believe it is that God is Father, and in an effort to give us a picture of who he is, he created a shadow version of that on earth. We're the shadow version. We're the analogy, not him. We're the analogy of what it is. Marriage is another analogy. It's a living parable of how God feels about his people. I did a wedding yesterday, and as the door opened, I have to always warn the groom, like, hey, when that door opens, you're going to be tempted to fall down. Don't fall down. Just stand there. Don't lock your knees. I'll be right here. If you start to fall, I'll catch you. I wish over the years, after 50 weddings, I had a little microphone on the men, that when that door opens and she walks in, because there is this shaking, rattling gasp that every groom gives at that moment. This intake of breath, but he can't catch his breath when she walks in. And there's going to come a day when the bride is presented, the church is presented to Jesus Christ, and he's going to give that rattling gasp for us. Those moments are beautiful, and it's a great picture. If you don't buy it, you can look at Ephesians chapter 5, 1 Peter chapter 2 and 3, Colossians chapter 3. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read all of it. I'm going to draw your attention to verse 32. Next slide. This mystery is profound. I'm saying it refers to Christ and the church. He spends a whole section talking about marriage, but in the middle of it, this diamond among diamond verses, he says, this is a mystery. He's been talking about marriage for 10 verses, and he says, but I'm not really talking about marriage, am I? I'm really talking about Christ and the church. That's only true. You have to talk about marriage is to talk about Christ and the church. And I believe that's exactly the case. God created, invented, researched, and designed marriage to be a living parable of his love for his people. So what is his vision? It is meant to express the gospel in a unique way. And I have a new favorite way of showing the gospel. I don't remember even for sure if I've shown this even here before. I love this so much, I share it all over the place. So let me show you this video that I think gives a great, beautiful picture of the gospel.
Before I tell you what I know about this weaving here, you've got a little bit of history. It sounds quite interesting. First, tell me what you know about it.
Well, I don't know an awful lot about it, except that it was given by Kit Carson, who I'm sure everybody knows in his history, given to the foster father of my grandmother.
And it's not just a chief's blanket, it's the first type of chief's blankets made. These were made in about 1840 to 1860, and it's called a Ute first phase.
A Ute?
A Ute first phase wearing blanket.
Wow.
And not only that, the condition of this is unbelievable. It's extremely rare. It is the most important thing that's come into the roadshow that I've seen. Do you have a sense at all of what we're looking at here in terms of value?
I haven't a clue.
Are you a wealthy man, Ted?
No.
Well, sir, I'm still a little nervous here, I have to tell you. On a really bad day, this textile would be worth $350,000. On a good day, it's about $500,000.
Oh, my God.
And you had no idea.
I had no idea. I was just laying on the back of a chair.
Well, sir, you have a national treasure.
Wow. Can't believe it. My grandmother, were poor farmers. I'm amazed. I'm flabbergasted.
Okay, so did Ted, who I'm going to owe a lot of drinks in heaven, I hope he's there for using his story so many times. Did Ted fold that blanket back up and lay it over the back of the chair when he got back home? I don't think so. He probably had it insured for $500,000 and hidden in a vault somewhere, right? It turns out, I'm pretty sure it was the same guy, for reasons I won't go into, but I think his son, this was in 2006, I think his son about 10 years later sold that Ute Chiefs wearing blanket for $1.8 million. So what I love about that is that it's been laying over the back of the chair all those years. And if I ask, how valuable was it laying over the back of the chair all those years gathering dust? A decent percentage of you in the room would say, oh, it wasn't valuable. And I would question that. I would say, wait a minute. So what you're saying changed on the day of the Antiques Roadshow was the value of the blanket? Because what I would submit to you is that what changed was the ignorance of the owner. See, there's a fascinating parable in Matthew chapter 13. This is the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. And then in his joy, he goes to sell all he has to get that field. Now we have 5 parables of lost things in the Bible. We have the lost sheep, and we have the prodigal son, and we have the pearl of great price, and we have the lost coin, and we have the hidden treasure. Now, 2 of those Jesus interprets for us, so we don't have to guess at what the interpretation is, what the correct interpretation is. Nobody thinks Jesus is the one sheep, and we're supposed to risk the 99 sheep to go find him, because Jesus tells us we are the lost sheep. He is the shepherd who risks all to find us and who celebrates when he finds us, right? After all, 1 Corinthians tells us that we have been purchased with a price. If that's the case, and that's the interpretation tool that we need, then we are the pearl of great price. And we are the prodigal son. That one's easy to understand. And we are the lost coin. And we're the treasure hidden in a field. And other people just see a field, something to be used. a transactional image of human interaction. But you have some fool who sells a field because he's unaware there's a treasure. And what I would tell you is, when you think back on your life about the way you're treated by your parents or your grandparents, the way you're treated by your neighbors or your second grade class or your fourth grade girlfriend or whatever it was, you need to hear there was never anything wrong with the treasure. That wasn't the problem. And it's still not the problem. And the gospel of Jesus Christ says others see field, but he sees treasure. Treasure worthy of going and selling everything he has with joy in order to purchase that field, in order to get that treasure. The gospel is about a treasure hunter who found you and me and thought we were worth selling everything in order to get. That's the gospel. What an amazing picture. And then what if this opulent, over-the-top, generous God said, you know what else I'm going to do? Here's what else I'm going to do. I'm going to then put somebody else in your life whose job is to agree with me on this. That their main job is to communicate to you day in and day out that they agree that you are treasure. That's their main job, is to live out this parable, the parable of this gospel with me, that would be lived out day after day, who knows you and loves you anyway, right? This is the sign of the great marriage. Victor Hugo, who wrote maybe the greatest treatise on grace ever, that was his intention, by the way, called Les Mis, says this: the supreme happiness of life is the conviction of being loved for yourself, or more correctly, being loved in spite of yourself. What if someone knew you and loved you anyway? What if someone knew you and chose you anyway? If you know yourself at all, if you've ever met you, you probably don't see a lot of treasure there. And if you do, you may have a different problem, right? You probably don't see a lot of treasure when you look at yourself. You know what's going on in your head. You know how frail and flawed you are. And so what's it like when there's a God who delusionally loves you as treasure because he says so? How do you know you're treasure? Because he said you were treasure. And here's what's wild. By the way, you can't decide your treasure yourself. You can't make yourself treasure. It's one of the biggest dangers right now. Young people, please hear this. As you're being told by the world that only you get to speak about you, that only you get to say things true about you, you need to know that is craziness on a stick. That is insanity at the highest level. It is raw sewage. We need other people to speak identity into us, and we certainly need God to speak identity into us, because he's right and we're not. When we say, I'm not treasure, and he says, but I say you are, well, when you vote, I'm going to tell you who wins, the one who's omniscient, who's never wrong, and who says you're treasure. And what if there was someone in my life, what if he put someone in my life who could tell me that, who could live that out? Now, how do you do that? And by the way, he knows what he's doing too. Look at these marriage satisfaction scores. Now, there's lots and lots and lots of these, but one of the things that strikes me that's fascinating is how often when you do marriage satisfaction scores, the final number is higher than the starting number. The people married 30 years, 40 years, 50 years actually have often higher marriage satisfaction scores, by the way, across the board in every area, than newlywed couples. Does that get taught in the media? Do people talk about that in the media? Never. And yet it turns out hearth fires are better than house fires. House fires are hotter, I'll give you that. Methamphetamine out here is pretty fun, but it'll kill you, right? It'd be great, except that it kills you, right? And so it turns out what you need is something every day that can speak heat and truth and light into your life a little bit every day across time, and it even creates more joules of heat eventually after decades when we think from the other person's perspective. Here's what the Apostle Peter, who was married, Paul's marriage language is always pretty highly theological because he wasn't married. And Peter's is very practical here. The language here in 1 Peter, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. That's very Bible-y language. What he says here is, husbands, think. It's actually the Greek. Essentially says, husbands, you got to think. And this is Peter. So you know what Peter's saying. Think before you speak. Right? This is Peter's one life lesson that it takes him his whole life to learn. Hey, I've got one lesson for you. Before you say something, stop and think. This is true in his relationship with Christ. I would suspect, imagine being Peter's wife, by the way. How fun must that have been? If those of you married to ADD husbands, you're like, not always fun, right? So you go, okay, so He says, husbands, think. This, I think, is a great rule for all of us, that we have to learn, if we're going to treasure someone, we've got to learn to see the world through their eyes. We have to learn to care about what's different about the way they say it. We treat them as sacred, special, worthy of special treatment. So I'm going to throw out a couple of examples in the limited time that I have, a couple of examples of this that we know as general tendencies. These are not universal, but they're pretty common enough that I can throw them out there and at least it could give you a head start. Now, these are typically male-female differences, again, which are almost never universal, although they can come close to it. It's not enough for you to become an expert, a PhD in male-female. You have to become a PhD in the one person you're spending the rest of your life with. That's what you've got to master, because they may be different in regards to some of this stuff. So here you go. One is, typically men communicate critically and women communicate consultatively. In other words, men typically communicate, that you're going to want to argue with me when I say this, but I'll show you how I'm right. When men typically communicate in a way that says, here's information I think you need. Okay? Women tend to communicate in a way that says, here's communication that I think you want. Okay? Women typically communicate to increase intimacy, to share life. Men typically communicate to share information. That's why I have no intuition for this. My wife loves to call me when she's not around. I know she's not around. I already know this, but I think she's calling just to remind me I'm not with you, right? The best example is when she calls me on her way home. Hey, I'm about 2 minutes from home. I'm like, okay. I probably would have picked up on that when you drove in like 2 minutes. Thanks for sharing, right? I would never do that. I would never instinctively do that. I do, by the way, but I call her on the way home every time. I have no instinct for that. I think it's the most ridiculous thing ever, but it's special to her, so we're going with it, right? This is, by the way, the process is you go, oh, this matters to you. Oh, this is special to you. Well, then I better adjust the way I do things then. So imagine, here's one of the best examples ever. Imagine that Jana Broderick and my wife Ginger, they're driving down the road together, and my wife says, hey, Jan, I think you're following that car in front of us too closely. Okay? Jana would probably say some version of, oh, I'm so sorry, Ginger, let me slow down a little bit. Okay? Now, guys, listen, here's what just happened. My wife said, Jana, I know you love me. And I'm feeling some weird, probably unnecessary anxiety. And I think it may have to do with how closely you're following that car in front of us. And I know, I'm not saying you're doing it wrong. I'm just saying for some reason it's creating anxiety for me. And I know you would want to know that. And so I'm letting you remember, information you would want. I'm giving you information I know you would want. And Jana's like, you're right, I do care. I do love you. And if something as simple as slowing down a little bit can take away some of your anxiety, that's low-hanging fruit. I'm happy to do that. I'm so sorry the way I'm driving has created this emotion for you. I will slow down. Okay? I'm not kidding, guys. That entire conversation just happened. Now, if Wayne and I are driving down the road and I say, Wayne, you're following that car in front of us too closely, what I mean is, your dad should have taught you the 2-second rule. Why don't you know how to drive? Okay? That's what I mean. And Wayne will take it that way. Wayne's gracious. He probably wouldn't. But most guys would go, I can pull over if you want to drive. Right? That's what most guys would say. Which is why, men, I would never say it, right? I would never tell Wayne he's following that car too closely. Why would I want to pick a fight about that, right? How many of you guys early on in your marriage for about the first 2 years, your constant thought was like, why does she want to fight about this? Hey, why'd you turn left rather than right? Why do you want to fight about that, right? She doesn't. She's clumsily trying to create intimacy between the two of you, right? And so that's what's happening there. So now you can see the train wreck when it happens. My wife and I are driving down the road. If I'm driving, which I never do when we're driving together, and she says, hey, I think you're following that car in front of us too closely. And she's saying, I know you love me, and I know you care about me, and I'm feeling this anxiety, and I know you wouldn't want me to feel this anxiety, and so I'm letting you know that this creates a little anxiety for me. And I say, I can pull over if you want to drive. Because what I heard was, I'm your mom and you're an idiot. And the only woman who I really care about her opinion of me very much thinks I'm an idiot and I don't even know how to drive. So I try to shut down that emotion in her, right? Because that's how we as men deal with emotions typically. You're upset. You being upset makes me upset. So I need you just to stop being upset, and then we can both be happy, okay? See, solved it. Solved it like that. You just don't be upset, then neither one of us has to be upset, and we can both be happy people, right? And so I try to shut down that way of thinking. I'm going to shut that down so you don't ever think that way again. And what she hears is, oh, you don't love me, and you don't care about my perspective, and you don't care about my emotions. You're more concerned with your ego than anything else. I'm not going to have women do it, but if I ask women in the room, how many of you would never, at this point, after being married a year or two, would never comment on your husband's driving because you don't want the emotional blowback you're going to get if you even comment on it? So you sit there, by the way, and what's happening, we know from the research, is that the door called arousal is being locked the whole time she's sitting there going, I can't even say anything about this or I'll get yelled at, okay? This is key. Here's one of the things we know. So imagine, guys, let's continue to play this out. This is where the fall apart can often happen. So he shows up, guys, you show up with a dozen roses and you say, hey, I got you some flowers. And she says, oh my gosh, those are beautiful. Now yellow are my favorite, okay? My experience is about half the men in the room know to go, okay, yellow next time. Because he gets that. This is consultation. He understood that as consultation, not criticism. But about half the men still hear that as criticism. Oh, I got you flowers and you're going to criticize me? Even that? Okay. And so that shuts him down. Now, delicately, I'll say it this way. Imagine in the bedroom and she says some version of the same thing. Hey, I enjoy that experience, just a little slower. Now, at that stage, most men know that's consultation. She's giving me information I want. She's the only one with that information, and I want that information. And we experience that as consultation. Guys, what's wild is over the years of counseling and teaching on this stuff, and I asked women, what's different in those three conversations? Hey, I think you're following that car too closely. I love those flowers, but yellow's my favorite. Could you keep doing that, but do it slower? And women will say, it's the same conversation all three times. All three times, all she's saying is, here's how to love me well. It turns out when men are like, I don't know how to love my wife well, it turns out, if you watch, she's told you every day, all day, 10 times a day, how to love her well. And you've taken it as criticism time after time after time. But here's what's cool. Ladies, if you learn how to communicate, learn how to see through our lens, and you can say to him when you're driving down the road, some version of, hey, I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong, but I'm feeling some weird anxiety, and it may be connected to how you're following that car. And it would really help my day if you slowed down a little bit. It really would make you just feel better and feel closer to you if you'd slow down a little bit. Well, if you say it that way, most of us as men would go, oh, sure, I can slow down. That's no big deal. Because you've interpreted for us, this isn't me saying you're an idiot and I'm your mom, right? So these are some things, us learning to do this, learning to see things through the eyes of the other person is extraordinarily valuable. And here's what's crazy. When you take the time and energy to understand their perspective, they will feel treasured. They will see that you care about where they are. Remember, he came to us. Jesus came all the way to us. He came all the way from heaven to earth, and from earth to the life of a servant to a cross, and the death of a cross. And then he came back from that cross. And then he came all the way to reconcile with us. And the example of the Apostle Peter, he even takes the last step. I'll love you. Just give me whatever love you can give me. He takes all those steps to reach us where we are as the shepherd. He creates a high, noble, romantic, poetic, mystical, sacred view of marriage that will be inspiring to our children and our neighbors. I'm telling you, I've come to believe over the years that the reason we lose students when they go off to college is not because of sex, drugs, rock and roll, or liberal professors. It is because their parents' marriage stunk. And there was nothing inspiring about the gospel in their parents' marriage. And the Apostle Paul told us back in Ephesians 5, it is a living parable of his love for his people, bad and good. If your children see that you don't love your husband and love your wife well, that you don't sacrifice for them and submit to them, then they understand perfectly well that what you're saying about the gospel is that it's a joke. But if we could learn to have these marriages be powerful, filled with the power that God gave us, naked and unashamed, that we're recreating a garden like God who loves to give good gifts, we're creating for us, and we learn to do it his way, man, huge. I don't think we could build churches fast enough if we had marriages like this. I think people would be desperately clawing at the door as their marriages are failing, saying, help me, help me, help me. If we understand our spouse the way they see, how the arousal door locks and how they unlocks, to make good use of that knowledge. And by the way, let me show you the real quick why it gets really hard, to show you my last example, or my second last example, the marriage satisfaction scores again. You'll notice most marriages start off pretty good. And then at about year 2, 3, 4, 5, somewhere around there, they face a cataclysm. Some massive catastrophe hits marriage, and it plummets down to almost its lowest point. What is that? Children, right? Children are devastating to marriage. It's because we are different, so different from each other, and we spend psychological energy to love each other well. If she's an extrovert and I'm an introvert, I'm going to have to spend psychological energy to go party with her. Or she's going to have to spend psychological energy to hang out at home. For most men, sexual engagement is integrated into our identity. It's part of who we are. It's integrated well into who we are. Men never come in and say, I wish my wife would pursue me more non-sexually. It's not because men just want sex. By the way, the research blows that out of the water. What men want is what sex means. I'm going to further detail there because it's too much. But men typically integrate it into our identity. So when you pursue him sexually, we believe you're pursuing us. The Feldens found this out. In her book, she says to the women, when you say no to your husband sexually, he feels like you're saying no to him at the core level. That's what it feels like. So with that in mind, understanding that that's the perspective, what happens is, but what if the fact that women don't integrate, most women don't integrate sexual engagement into their identity? Women spend their whole lives wondering, is this about me or is this about sex? Because most women naturally, intuitively divide that out. Well, so what that means is because it doesn't come naturally, she has to spend some psychological energy to engage there. Say 20%. I'm just making up a number, no one knows. 20% of her psychological energy to engage there. Well, when they were first married, she always had 20%. Right? I mean, she went to bed with 40, 50% still sitting there, just laying around all the time, no one demanding anything of her. And all of a sudden they have children, and these little emotional, psychological vampires just suck all the life out of her. And so then when it comes time to like, hey, we want to engage, for him it costs 0, and it's worth 40 points of psychological energy. Now listen, here's what's wild. For her, it's also worth 40. It just costs 20. Because it's not integrating her identity. So imagine if I said, hey, I've got $40,000 in cash up here. If you will right now bring me $20,000 in cash, if one of you will bring me $20,000 in cash right now, you can have my $40,000 in cash. How many of you would do it? You have $20,000 in cash on you? No, you don't. I assume no one's actually sitting. If you are, meet me after, out back, where there's no cameras. If you like, no, you know, if you have $20,000 in cash. So when I say it's not that it's not a good deal, it's that you don't have the 20. As to what transactional marriage books say, what husbands try to explain, we sit down and we go like, no, this is really important. No, this is number one. No, I'll tell you, I'll give you $50,000 for your 20. I'll give you $75,000 for your 20. I'll give you $500,000 for am I solving the problem? No. I'm not seeing it through her lens and understanding that what I've got to do is figure out how to get her 20 points. So that if she wants to invest those 20 points of energy in me, she can. Into our sex life, she can. Doesn't mean she will. I'm not buying anything from her. But understand that if she doesn't have the 20 points, me making a big deal about how important this transaction is, me trying to negotiate the transaction is accomplishing absolutely nothing but driving her soul into the dirt. And we've got to take a different tact on it. We've got to be able to see it from their perspective. We get this. In fact, this is what I think that this is the kind of application that John is saying. We love to take the teachings of Scripture of Jesus for neighbors and all that kind of stuff and spread it out into the world. By the way, the second drop off is teenagers. I won't go into that, but that's the second dive. I'm not kidding. But we often don't take the teachings of Scripture and apply it to our marriage. Just the basic teachings of how to be a good neighbor, how to be a good Samaritan to our spouse would revolutionize our marriages. Look at what John says in his first letter, 1 John 3:18. Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and truth. Yes, he means that for the whole world, which includes your spouse. That you need to know the truth about who they are, care about them, and then act on that. Knowing, caring, learning. Matthew 6:21, Jesus says, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. There you go. If you're in a boring marriage, it means you're a boring person. It doesn't mean you're married to a boring person. It means you're not investing your treasure where it's supposed to be. I want to give you the pop quiz, and then we'll be done. Last little section. Here's my quick pop quiz. Imagine, if you will, it's one of those days, and you've just been on each other's nerves all day. Everybody has days like that. I don't mean you're yelling and screaming and throwing stuff. I mean, you're just not in sync. You just can't seem to get along. Everything you say is wrong, and everything the other person says seems to be wrong, and you just can't make it work, right? At the end of that day, he says, so do you want to mess around? And she turns to him like he's grown a third eye on a stalk out of the middle of his forehead and says, are you crazy? What's wrong with you, right? Now, if we did this training right, you'd be able to answer the pop quiz. Guys, I would say, how does she interpret that moment? Now, we've not been able to cover most of it, but if I were to ask that at the end of the training, and you would hopefully be able to say, oh, she interprets that this way. She says, he doesn't even like me. He doesn't get along with me at all. He doesn't like my company. He doesn't enjoy me, but he sure still wants to mess around, doesn't he? She divides him out, and she feels like all he cares about is this one. Now, here's what's wild. I want you to imagine, ladies, that at the end of a day like that, your husband sits down, knee to knee, takes your hands, looks you in the eye, and says, I just want you to know something. After a day like today, when we can't seem to get anything together, I want you to know something very clearly. I choose you. And I don't want to be chosen by anybody but you. You're my treasure. And I know we've not been getting along today, but I just want you to hear that unequivocally true. I choose you. What's wild is I will say that in a conference, and half the women's eyes are brimming with tears as I'm saying that. And here's the wild part. That's what he thought he said. That's exactly what he thought he just said. And so to understand this, if we can learn to see it through the other person's lens, one, and then love them enough. God created a system in which we can treasure each other in his name and re-communicate the gospel 1,000 times a day to this person who needs to hear it 1,000 times a day. And we have this special sacred calling to do that. How do I communicate to my wife over and over again? Even in conflict, it's still my responsibility to communicate to her. You are treasure. God says so. You may not feel it. I may not even feel it. That just makes us wrong. I still communicate the truth of that. Now, you may be thinking, that's not possible. By the way, when I understood the research on this and understood the way this worked, the first thing I had to do was repent. Was to go to her and say, I am so sorry. I thought what I said made sense. And I now understand it didn't to you at all. It didn't make sense. Maybe you think this is too hard. It just isn't you. Maybe, but the truth is, I would agree with you, it isn't any of us. None of us are capable of pulling this off. What Jeremy said earlier about walking in our own flesh. You're not going to pull this off there. To forgive the hurts and rejections and disappointments and even sins of the past in his name. To grow into something that produces the fruit of love and patience and kindness. We're like lamps with a cord, and we've got to plug that cord into the real power source. This was brought to my attention last Sunday. Liam Garvey, the associate pastor at Charlotte Chapel in Edinburgh, was preaching last week on this from Ephesians 1. And again, I just want to draw your attention to the concepts. We can put the verses up there. You can look them up later. But the basic message here in Ephesians chapter 1 that Paul is saying is, of course, this is impossible to you, which is why you have the power of Jesus Christ flowing through you. That you would say, I could never do this type of thing. And you're right, you couldn't, but he can through us. And it will defer to him and defer to the fact that he sees your spouse as treasure, worthy of dying on a cross for. Then you can try to learn to think and talk in a way that tells them the same thing. If you will, pray with me. Father, we pray that you would help us to accomplish miracles in you. Lord, that you would accomplish these miracles in us. The greatest of which, of course, was being reconciled to you. And you accomplished that. Lord, thank you that we get to be the recipients of such a wonderful gift of being reconciled to the God who created us and who we have so deeply offended. Lord, how crazy the second one, probably maybe the second greatest miracle in all of creation, is the idea that human beings could live in loving, sacrificial intimacy with each other. And I pray that through the power of your Spirit, we could accomplish that in the lives of our spouses and find great joy in it. It's going to be hard, and people are going to leave here. Some people are going to leave here excited, and they're going to get cold water dumped on their head in 10 minutes. And Lord, I pray you would help them to push through the power of your Holy Spirit. Whatever it takes, whatever help is needed, however we can get there, Lord, I pray our marriages would be living parables of your love for your people, that our bedrooms would be living parables of your grace and your love and your gospel. And I pray these things in your Son's magnificent name. Amen.